So we have our final speaker of the first block, Pontus Böckman, everybody.
Well, hejsan. As a Swede, I've gotten a lot of questions over the last couple of years about the Swedish quote-unquote experiment. What happened really with the Swedish COVID-19 pandemic response? Was it just a Russian roulette, like it says here on a headline from The Guardian? This was pretty early. This was in March 2020. And it illustrates, four very lively men here enjoying life, looking very, very happy at the halfway in Stockholm. So health experts were warning we are playing Russian roulette with our public, with our population. And the guy who did this, who got all the attention, is Anders Tegnell. He was at the time head of the National Swedish Health Agency, and you can say one thing about him. He was very consistent and very cocky as well, very, very stubborn. This is what he said when he was criticized that we were doing something very different and special, and said, "We are an agency of 500 people with competence in many fields. No one else has the combined expertise that we have." So that's where he started from, right? So, nice guy, but he was very popular in Sweden at the time, because I think you do need somebody who stands up. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to save you from this madness. So what did he do? Well, the thing that I think got lost, especially in the foreign press, was that he was following a plan. He had a plan. It wasn't an experiment. He said, we've been spending decades preparing for a pandemic, because we knew that it would come. And now we're not going to throw that plan out the window just because we're panicking. We're going to follow that plan as set down. So the thing that he did, and I'm talking about him, not about politicians, but I'll get back to the role of politicians here later on. So there's a limit of assembly to 50 people, which was quite high if you compare with the rest of the world. It was later down to 8 later in the pandemic. For a long time it was 50 people. And then there was so you should stay home at any sign of illness, you should work from home if possible. Elderly should be very careful, self-isolate, don't visit your grandma, things like that, and avoid traveling if possible. None of this was really controversial, except maybe the limit of 50 people, because that's quite high. What surprised people was that this was not restrictions. There were no official restrictions in Sweden. No fines for breaking these things. These was recommendations. It was recommended. And there was no lockdown. Primary schools remained open during the total pandemic. So young children were still going to school. And the reason for that was that we don't want to keep all the children home, because that will keep all the parents home as well, which of course they should be at home, but they should be working from home, not just, we would shut down the whole society. That would be too much of a thing. And young children do not suffer very badly from this disease anyway. Very controversially, there was no mask mandate. It was later, very much later, added as for certain situations. But the reason that was given was that we don't believe, or rather Anders Tegnell did not believe, and he said so, I don't believe that people will use them properly. They don't know how to use them. They will put them on wrong. They will use them for too much long time. They will use old ones. And they won't be as effective as they will be in a hospital. So instead of focusing all our efforts, like the rest of the world seem to do, to nag about masks, we will not do that. There was no mask mandate. So that was surprising. So why was this approach different? Well, it boils down to two things, really. It's legislation and there is the culture. So from legislation point of view, we have very strong foundational laws in Sweden guarding the individual freedom and choice that you can. So it wasn't easy. You couldn't make laws about this very easily. There was a very strong protected right of assembly, which explains that they couldn't limit it more than to 50 people at a time. Then there's also the role of politicians here. There is a reliance in the way the Swedish society works, is that we rely on the governmental bodies, not on the politicians. And there's actually a special kind of crime. I translated it as the ministerial interference. It's probably known as something else, but you understand what it is. If a minister goes down to an agency, I tell you to do this and this and this, that's actually a crime. It's illegal to do that. So what happened was that the politicians said, this is not something for politicians. This is for experts. So we hand you all over to Anders Tegnell, and he's going to tell you what to do. So that's the legislation that is probably different from many other countries. Then there's the cultural change, or difference, I should say. So there's generally a very high trust in authorities and experts in Sweden. And I think that has to do with that we haven't had any wars for a very, very long time. Our transition from monarchy to democracy was very peaceful. And we haven't had any reason to distrust our local government for a very long time. So people are basically, they're okay with being told these are the experts, these are the politicians. We know they mean well, so we better do what they tell us. There's also a factor of self-policing. You self-police not just yourself, but your neighbors as well. This is if your neighbor parks the car in the wrong place on the street, even though it's not in the way of anything, but it's the wrong place. You're not supposed to park your car there. People look at you strange. That's not. So you avoid that. You care about what the neighbors say. So if you get recommendations, everybody's sort of checking, are you following the recommendations? Maybe they're not telling, but you can see it in their eyes, right? So the result of this is that Swedes do pretty much what they're told. And so there is a less need for hard regulations, which they weren't. They were just recommendations. So how did it go then? Okay, 2 months later, Sweden now has the highest number of COVID deaths in the world. This is in May 2020, so it's not looking good, is it? There were numbers behind this, from this. They put it in a table, I put it in a chart. So this is from Our World in Data, and Sweden has, this is the average number of COVID deaths over the last week, for 1 week in May, but there's per day, so it's complicated. But the thing is, 6.1 is Sweden, UK, on second place. You don't want to be on this chart at all, but so 5.6. So, but statistics are difficult. So what I did was I went back to Our World in Data now, a couple of weeks ago, and looked, do the numbers still look the same for that same week, way back when? And no, they don't. So the UK was actually worse than Sweden. It doesn't change it radically, but there's a bit of a difference. Peru went through the roof. I don't know what happened there, but and Monaco was very strange. They suddenly didn't have any deaths during this week. So statistics are hard. Oops. Right. And then to add to this, I'm talking about deaths of COVID deaths we are talking about. What is that? Well, we all know that that's different. Is it dying of COVID? Is it dying of pneumonia while having COVID? Is it dying 2 weeks after being recovered from COVID? Everybody interpreted it a little bit different, or there's a risk at least that countries did interpret this different. And then there's the MD who signs the death certificate, who also could be a little bit, I think it's COVID. And so it's hard to compare that between different countries. So I'm looking instead on excess mortality, because if people are dying more than usual, and it's not COVID, well, what is it? Well, it is COVID in this period, I guess. And Sweden was in the middle here. You can't see the other countries there, but Sweden, it wasn't worse. It was not perfect either. UK was much worse, even though you did have lockdowns. I don't know how you can... it's hard to say why, but that's how it was. Of course, you wanted to be Denmark, and Denmark was below here. But look at Denmark is actually increasing at the moment for some reason. The period is up until 2 weeks ago. So what's the verdict? Well, it's hard to tell, actually. I know you skeptics, you can understand that it's not just black and white. On the bad side, we'd have high mortality among the elderly, which also was the same in a lot of other countries, I believe. The hesitancy to recommend masks was strange, and we did poorly compared to Nordic countries. On the other hand, the recommendations were very consistent because they followed a plan. And they were largely followed. So that's good. That's good. Keeping primary schools, we can see now that Swedish children are doing much better than, for example, Norway, which just a couple of weeks ago came out with a report about the problems they're having. And we did better than the EU average. So then this is not scientific at all. This last slide, it's my own reflections, and it basically boils down to politicians make very bad scientists because politicians want to see black or white, and scientists don't want to do that. It's all a grayscale. And scientists are very bad policymakers because they can't make up their mind really. Well, on the one hand it's this, on the one hand it's that. So asking, as we did in Sweden, the scientists to make all the decisions, they were not prepared to that. They couldn't take decisions. They said, well, we think this, more research is needed, and things like that. So that's it.
Pontus Böckman, thank you very much.
7 seconds, right?
All of our speakers are being far too accurate to the schedule, and I haven't had a chance to use the horn yet. I'm going to use it on somebody, even if you're a minute less. It's coming.
Feel free.
So, some great questions here. First one is from Aaron. Neurodivergent individuals often prefer explicit rules over cultural norms. Do you know if neurodivergent Swedes struggled with the COVID approach?
The short answer is no, I do not. And I'm not an expert in the field, and I haven't seen any research on that. So sorry, no, I don't know.
Question from Claire. Has there been a shift or decline in trust in experts and authority after the Swedish experiment?
I believe not. I think I saw research saying that it's been unchanged. It's still the same as before COVID.
And Igor asks, did people use masks despite the lack of mandate, and did they use them correctly?
Well, it's a grey area, right? So some people did, and I think that there were local recommendations as well. Not everybody listened to Anders Tegnell. So certain shops, buses and stuff, they implemented their own recommendations and said, we want you to wear a mask. And that was largely followed. But as soon as you got out of the shop again, they took them off. And yes, I saw a lot of people using them almost backwards. People didn't understand at all. People taking them off to sneeze and then putting them back off again.
As there were substantial... Screen's just scrolling, thank you very much. A substantial number of excess deaths in care homes in Sweden in 2020. What were the lockdown measures introduced in care homes?
There were no lockdowns. There were don't visit your parent or your grandfathers or grandparents, and there were instructions given to the homes for the elderly, which were largely not followed because they didn't have the resources or they didn't have the education on how to do it. So there, I think we failed the most. I think the recommendations was sort of okay, but they weren't followed. And the care for the elderly has been very decentralized over the last 20 years in Sweden. And some of them are very small institutions with very poor resources or lack of education.
Another anonymous question. How did Sweden do in terms of hospitals, emergency services during the waves? And... you just removed the question from me there. Thank you. But that's the question.
Oh, okay, that's a question. I don't have the numbers in my head, but there were problems, of course. There were at times people were being stacked in the corridors at the hospitals because there were too many to really care for. I think that wasn't. I mean, that was of course bad. I don't think that was a disaster compared to other countries. I think all countries had more or less the same problem there. I don't think we stuck out.
Evan asks, some US politicians would say they told us so. Why bother with mandates? But did Swedes follow the recommendations more than rugged individualistic Americans?
Well, I haven't compared. I don't know that many rugged, what do you call it, individualistic Americans. But as I said, I think the recommendations were followed very, very well to the extent that they were issued. I think that if there had been more mandates about masks, people would have used them more.
And are there any data on how common long-term health effects are compared to other countries?
How common?
Long-term health, long COVID, etc.
Well, I don't know that. I'm just surprised that, I mean, the elderly, they often, unfortunately, died. So talking about long COVID for elderly, I don't know if that's a thing even.
And we have a final comment. Brem, I'm not going to ask him about order of operations. We've done that already. Thank you very much. Pontus Böckman, everybody.
Thank you.